to see the last of you. A couple of things I'll mention now. Some of this I'll probably repeat again when we have our final exam. But just because people's brains are often not working quite right for exam, give you a couple chances to absorb pieces of information here. Okay, first thing, my plan is to get the grades posted on the webpage all updated probably sometime tomorrow. There won't be much quiz grades and the midterm grade. Those should all end up getting up on the course webpage. I don't think there's anything else that's relevant to your final grade except the final exam. So you should have all the information I got in terms of how you're doing heading into the final. A couple other related issues. Well, when we've got a final exam coming up at some point, I'm still not entirely sure when and where it is, because I haven't bothered to look yet, because I know it wasn't today. But don't send me email asking me when and where the final exam is. If you haven't figured it out yet, just go to the Quantland Course Search thing and look at the courses you're currently registered in, and it'll have the final exam date, time, location, and everything listed on there. And it's probably easier to find that than the actual final exam schedule that is buried somewhere in the bowels of the university website where it's very hard to find. Now, when it comes to the final exam, not that I pay too much attention to what the powers that be tell me to do around here, but the general regulation is I'm supposed to get the final grades turned in within, I think, 3 days of you writing the final exam. And that's probably not going to be an issue. I usually don't have much problem doing that. So, now I am almost certainly not going to post the final exam grades on that webpage. So, within probably 3 days of writing the final, more or less, you will see your final grade for the course if you log on to wherever you see that kind of shit. Now, I'm going to assume that given all the other grade information and your final grade of the course, I'm going to leave it as a little puzzle for you to reverse engineer the arithmetic to figure out what your final exam grade was if you really want to know. If you can't do that arithmetic, that might explain your final exam grade right there. You might not need any more information. But I'm probably not going to post the actual final exam grades. However, that doesn't mean you're not allowed to know what your final exam grade was or how it goes or how it went or anything. Because I don't teach in the fall is my semester off, I will not be around. That's when I get to take all my vacation time. And as cruel as it may sound, once I'm on vacation, I don't give a shit about you and your grades and all that stuff. I'm not paying any attention to that. I'm not looking at my email. I'm not doing anything while I'm on holidays. And that's going to start on, I think, the 1st of September. So if there are any post-final exam issues that you want to talk to me about, you're going to have to do that before the 1st of September. So that gives you at least a couple of weeks to stew on your grade and decide if you want to look at your exam or talk to me about something. Now, if a bunch of people all want to see their final exams, I'm probably not going to be super stoked on the idea of making 15 different trips in from Chilliwack to talk to 15 different people. So if there seems to be some demand, I will do my best to work out some particular day when I will come in and you can come and look at your exam if you want and so on. Otherwise, if there's anything that we need to talk about, we're going to have to do that before the end of August, or you're going to have to wait till November sometime when I become back in service again. So be aware of that. Now, another thing I want to mention, I told this to a handful of people who were still here at the end of the proceedings last week, but I don't think I've told this to everybody, so just so that I've tried to reach everybody here. What I am going to do with regards to exam grades, we've got 2 midterm grades, and they worked out for you personally, and then we've got a final exam coming up. So what I am going to do with regards to assessing the final grade, And this is the main reason why I like to have a comprehensive final exam to cover the whole course. So there's a fair amount of stuff on there, at least in terms of subject material, that you've already been tested on, and you're going to be seeing the same kinds of stuff again showing up on the final. There's going to be a certain amount of stuff on the final exam, like things we covered last week and this week, that you haven't been tested on before. I might put a little bit of emphasis on the stuff that you haven't been tested on, but not much. It's not going to be like half stuff from the last 2 weeks and half everything else or anything that unbalanced. I'll try and have questions covered pretty much the entire course. And I do that partly because I want to feel comfortable doing this if I decide to do it, which I usually do. If you get a higher percentage grade on the final exam than you got on either or both of the midterms, I will replace the lower midterm grade with your final exam grade. So it doesn't work the other way around. So there's no way this can make anybody's grade worse than it would otherwise be if I just did things exactly the way I said I was in the syllabus. But potentially, you could be writing a final exam that could account for, I guess, 70% of your final grade. Now, that would only happen if your final exam grade was higher than both of your midterm grades. So if you get a 75% on the final exam and you got 50% on both midterms, I'll calculate your grade as if you got 75% on all 3 exams. So again, this can't make anybody's grade worse than it would otherwise be, but it does potentially allow people some room to dig themselves out of a hole if they have dug themselves into one. Having said that, I feel obligated to point out that if you did badly on the midterms and you don't do anything different preparing for the final, you're going to do bad on the final too, and this is not going to help you. So the only way this is going to help you is if you somehow do something different from the way you were doing it before. And well, how you manage that is up to you. But that is going to be the procedure as far as the final grades go. And you don't need to send me emails asking me if I'm going to do that or not. I'm telling you right now, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. So if your final exam grade is better than one of your midterm grades, I'll replace that one midterm grade. If it's better than both of them, I'll replace both of them. And I'm okay with doing this because ultimately I am more interested in having your final grade reflect what you can do by the end of the course than all the things you've fucked up all the way through. So there will be that. And again, well, hopefully I don't need to remind you of this, but I will anyway. You got to bring, a pen, pencil, and presumably a calculator to the final exam with you. I'm not going to let people use their phones as calculators, and I'm not going to let people pass calculators around between each other during the exam or anything else. So bring your own shit. Make sure you've got what you need to write the exam with. All right. Now, a couple of topics that I want to cover today that don't really have much to do with each other. Well, they're related in some very deep way that we won't bother exploring too much. But I'm going to talk a little bit about drugs, and I'm going to talk a little bit about time. Once we get big into drug depth, I'm going to talk about time. It'll be all mystical, man. It'll be really cool. Now, these are both areas that I personally have been involved in research-wise at various points in my overly long career. Now, this sort of learning and drugs idea, this was the thing that we were investigating in the lab that I did my graduate work in. So I had a fairly in-depth training in this kind of stuff. And this sort of thing is what my PhD thesis was about and so on. And when we get into the timing, this is some stuff that I did after I got my PhD when I was there being a postdoc slave for a couple of years. Now, there are plenty of potentially interesting things we can talk about with regards to drug use and operant or instrumental condition. Well, we're probably going to mostly ignore those and just deal with a sort of a classical conditioning analysis of drug use, which I think, goes a long way towards explaining a lot of the phenomena we see when people use various sorts of recreational drugs. That there's a lot of learning going on. And, well, three phenomena that I'll touch on each of these at least a little bit. The development of drug tolerance. The fact that if you take the same dose of a drug, take the same amount of some drug over and over and over again, you are going to start to become tolerant to that drug, and you will get less and less of an effect out of it. The sort of practical flip side of that, I mean, most drug users are not going to sit around moaning, oh, gee, I wish I got as high on my heroin as I used to. They're going to do more. They're going to increase the dose in order to obtain the effect they're after. Drug withdrawal, this was what my actual PhD thesis was all about, was doing a bunch of studies showing various effects you could explain through learning that are involved in drug withdrawal situations, where people who've been habitually using some drug for some period of time, all of a sudden they have, for whatever reason or another, they stop. Well, there's often some withdrawal symptoms that go along with that. And, well, this is more of a phenomenon, I mean, this is being masked these days somewhat. Overdose, drug overdoses. There's basically three kinds of drug overdose, roughly speaking. Now, these days, there are a lot of drug overdoses that are the result of people taking drugs that they don't really know what they are. And a lot of people are taking drugs that are laced with fentanyl, which is a very powerful drug, and they don't know how much they're getting, and they end up doing more than they thought they were doing, and they overdose and they die if nobody finds them quick. There's the whole fentanyl epidemic, which is getting a lot of play in the news and so on lately. So that's one kind of overdose. People who don't know, they think they're doing one drug, but they're actually doing something else. And I'm the last person to get up on a soapbox and tell you, well, drugs are bad, don't do drugs, kids. But if you're doing any kind of drug that is a white powder, you better know what the hell you're doing, because that's the shit that is killing people. I mean, oh, it's just an ecstasy. Well, how the hell do you know? Somebody cut it with fentanyl, and then you're in a fine box. The second type of drug overdose that's not that uncommon is just, rookie idiots who don't know what they're doing. People doing it for the first time or something, and they have no clue how much to do, and they do too much of something, and bad shit happens. But then there's this third class of overdose. People who've been doing these drugs for years, and they had perfectly good drugs, there's nothing wrong with the drugs, they weren't contaminated with fentanyl or anything, and they knew what they were doing, and they did the same amount of the drug that they would normally do, and they overdose. And this third category, as we'll see, this is the kind of thing that we can explain quite neatly, I think, with a conditioning analysis. And then we'll mention a couple other factors that might come up here. So, we talked at some length about the idea of, a conditional response, a CR, the kind of response you're going to see after an association has been learned, where some stimulus that normally would not produce a reflexive response is now capable of producing that response because you've associated that stimulus with an unconditional stimulus that will, without learning, produce that response. Now, I've stuck a word in the middle here, and this was something that we started doing in this particular lab run by a guy named Chef Siegel, who has since retired. But conditioned compensatory response. Now, this is not fundamentally different from the regular kind of conditional response thing we've been talking about in this course. We just stuck that word in there to make it more obvious and clear exactly what we're talking about and how this is relating to the effects on various phenomena that drug users are going to experience. So the first idea, and this is probably not the first time many of you have encountered this idea, it's a pretty important idea biologically if you're trying to understand how living things work. Fancy word, homeostasis. And I'm giving you the sort of the textbook dictionary definition of what homeostasis means here. The property of maintaining a non-zero baseline state. Now, that sounds kind of dry and not particularly informative, but at a physiological level, we are full of homeostatic systems. Systems that are designed to maintain some value that is not zero. And two fairly obvious examples. Your core body temperature regulation. Now, being a warm-blooded animal, if your guts started to get really cold, you're not just going to like slow down. If your core body temperature went up or down by about 10 degrees, you would very quickly die. So we have to keep our fingers and toes can get cold, and we can survive that. We might lose some fingers and toes if things are really bad, but that's not going to kill us. What kills you is when your core temperature starts to drop, and you get hypothermia, or your core temperature starts to go up. And we have to maintain that core body temperature in a pretty narrow range in order to not die. And that is a homeostatic system. Another one, your blood sugar levels. Your blood sugar is never supposed to be at zero. That's not the state that is supposed to be maintained. You're supposed to have some amount of sugar in your bloodstream. At least physiologically, that's the way you're evolved to operate. Now, in both of these systems, I mean, if you're dealing with a situation where your core temperature starts to rise and starts to get out of that range that it's supposed to be, well, with homeostatic systems, this is a big part of them, they have mechanisms kind of built into them that will attempt to correct any deviation. And I mean, I'm sure even without any sort of advanced biological education, you know how this works with regards to temperature regulation. I mean, if your core temperature starts to go up and get too high, what is your reflexive response to that? What mechanism kicks in to try and cool you down? You start sweating. You start dumping liquid, which is mostly water, onto the surface of your skin. You've got all these really fine capillary blood vessels just under the surface of the skin. As that water evaporates, it's taking energy out of the system. It's actually removing heat from that blood, and then that cooler blood can get circulated back into the core of the body and cool things down a little bit. If your body temperature starts dropping too low, what mechanism kicks in to try and get it back up again? Shivering. Your extremities just start doing some rapid non-directional muscle movement, which just has the opposite effect. It warms up the blood in your extremities, and then that warmer blood gets pumped back into the core and kind of raises your temperature. Now, it's not a completely foolproof system, as I'm sure you're aware. You can get so hot that sweating is not going to help you. You're going to die. You can get so cold that shivering is not going to help you. You're going to die. But within the range of temperatures that we're typically exposed to as humans, the system works reasonably well. But the whole idea is to keep that temperature in a certain range. If it starts going out of that range, something kicks in to try and push it back to where it's supposed to be. The same thing with blood sugar. You eat, you eat a giant chocolate sandwich for lunch or something. And yeah, that doesn't sound good to me either. I like chocolate and sandwiches. But so you have this, all of a sudden you've got all this sugar going into your bloodstream. More than you could possibly need to keep whatever physical things going on that you're doing. So the way this system works, if there's more sugar in your bloodstream than you need, your pancreas will start releasing insulin into the bloodstream, and that will promote converting a lot of that sugar into fat and taking it out of circulation and storing it for later. Now, and that should get your blood sugar level back down to a reasonable amount. And if your blood sugar level starts dropping too low, other mechanisms will kick in and will start breaking down that fat and introducing more energy back into the bloodstream and so on. trying to keep the blood sugar level at more or less sort of a non-zero baseline. So we're full of these homeostatic systems that are designed to sort of maintain some aspect of our biology at some level, and if it starts shifting too much in one way or the other, things will kick in to try and push it back to where it's supposed to be. So that's the idea of homeostasis. Now, the drug I'm going to talk about kind of by default, because it makes the best example in a lot of ways, is heroin. Now, most of this stuff would apply to pretty much any other recreational drug people might want to take for fun. But if you were to give yourself, or somebody else gives you, a good dose of heroin, that's going to produce several different effects. Now, the reason, as far as I know or have known a handful of pretty hardcore heroin addicts. The reason people do the drug is because you feel really good on the drug. Now, I'm not encouraging you to go out and take up heroin, but it is a pretty powerful, sort of warm, fuzzy, everything is just fine feeling. I can understand why people really value that experience. Euphoria, that's just our fancy word for feeling really good. But that heroin's going to do a lot of other things as well. And these are presumably not things heroin users take the drug in order to achieve. But when you get that dose of heroin, your core body temperature is going to start spiking up. Now, it's not enough to kill you. I mean, that's not what kills people that do too much heroin. This is what kills people that do too much heroin. Your breathing rate is going to start slowing down. And if it slows down to 0, well, that's not a good system. And this is what kills people who die of opiate overdoses. They stop breathing. And if you stop breathing, you got about 5 minutes for somebody to find you and get you started breathing again, or you're going to start having permanent brain damage. You got about 10 minutes before you're just going to have permanent deadness. So, and between 5 and 10 minutes, it starts to become a pretty dicey moral, ethical area. Because yeah, you can keep that person alive, but they are not going to be the same person they were when they did that big dose of heroin. And they may not be real happy about it either. Heroin, now again, I don't know anybody who does heroin for this reason, but heroin will make you constipated. Pretty much any opiate drug will constipate you. At least until you've been doing it for a good long time, you become really tolerant, and you'll start maybe pooping like a normal human again, at least a little bit. But constipation, your gastrointestinal motility slows way down. Things are not moving very quickly at all through the digestive tract. Now, first time I heard this term, I thought it was kind of funny, but it's because I have a pretty stupid sense of humor, I guess. But each of these things is called a pharmacological insult. So the drug is having these effects that are disrupting all these different physiological systems. And all of these things are homeostatic systems. They're all systems that, if nothing was screwing with them, would be maintaining you at some non-zero baseline rate. Now, you can understand, I mean, we already talked about body temperature. I mean, you can probably translate that same kind of logic to, how fast you're breathing. If you're not, if you're really physically exerting yourself or something and you need lots of oxygen, yeah, you're going to start breathing faster. But your respiration rate when you're just kind of sitting there doing nothing, I mean, it's supposed to be maintained at some level. If it starts getting too high, you're going to hyperventilate, you're going to overload on carbon dioxide, you're going to pass out. If it starts getting too low, then your tips and fingernails are going to start turning blue because you're not getting enough oxygen and so on. So we've got to keep that respiration rate within a certain zone. Same thing with, the passage of whatever you stuff into your face through your guts. It's not supposed to go as fast as possible. That's what we call diarrhea. When things are just rocketing through there at top speed and you don't have enough time to actually extract any nutrition out of it or get any water out of it or anything, it's kind of shooting out the other end. That's why people who, it's not usually a fatal problem in this part of the world, but it is in a lot of parts of the world. You get some bad case of diarrhea and you will die of dehydration because you can't absorb enough water. Even if you're drinking just glass after glass of water, it's just flying out of you like you're a big ugly garden sprinkler, and you're not absorbing any of that through the intestines into the bloodstream, and you dehydrate and you die. Now, the one that you might not have given much consideration to, it might seem a little bit counterintuitive, euphoria. Well, I like telling young people this. This is probably a misconception that a lot of you have, that you are supposed to be happy. Now, if there's any kind of supposed to be about your emotional state, you're supposed to be neutral. And there are, again, it's a little bit more complicated, but your emotional state is kind of a homeostatic system. You start feeling too good, things kick in to try and get you back down to a more rational level, and you start feeling too bad, things kick in to try and get you back up to a rational level. Now, they may or may not be able to correct the problem, and that's an issue with drugs as well, which we'll come back to in a second. But you introducing some drug into the system that's artificially, hugely elevating your emotional state, that's also a disruption. Now, here's where you got to kind of be careful about. There are sort of two potential perspectives here. If you're the person who, spent all day breaking into cars to get enough money to go buy your heroin, you want to feel good. You want that euphoria. But from a strictly biological perspective, that is a disruption, and your body is going to try and correct for that. Now, these disruptions, these pharmacological insults, these various effects that the drug produces when you take a bunch of it, or even a little bit of it in many cases, that is the very kind of biologically important event that we talked about, the kind of thing that would serve as an unconditional stimulus. And we do reflexively respond to these pharmacological insults, and these mechanisms kick in which try and correct for that disruption. Now, if you follow this logic a little bit further, if you are, for whatever reason, you decide to start yourself a good little heroin habit, you're taking this drug regularly, if you're a full-blown heroin addict, you're probably shooting up, 2-3 times a day. Now, if you can learn, again, this is not from the perspective of the person paying their hard-earned money for the drugs who want to get as high as they can get, but from the physiological perspective, if your body can learn to anticipate these biological disruptions and be prepared for them, they're going to be less disruptive. And physiologically, that's kind of a good thing. You're getting better prepared for these biological disturbances that the drug is going to produce. So they're going to be less disturbing. Now, on one hand, that's going to mean you get less high, which the drug user is probably not going to be happy about from that perspective. But physiologically, you are getting better at dealing with these disruptive events. So here's where we map our typical drug experience onto the basic terms of classical conditioning. So, as already indicated, the unconditional stimulus, well, there could be several unconditional stimuli here. We're just kind of lumping them all together and talking about them as if they're one thing. It's the drug-induced disturbances of homeostasis across a whole range of systems. And just in terms of shorthand, we're going to refer to this as the drug effects. Now, a mistake that people have sometimes made, and was a little before my time, but in the lab where I learned all this shit, they made this mistake for a while. And it took a while for them to realize that this makes no sense. But sometimes, if I ask a question, in terms of the drug, the classical conditioning view of drug use, what is the U.S., people will sometimes say, oh, it's the drug. No, not really. It's not the drug. The drug is just a thing. It's the effects the drug has on you physiologically. That's the U.S. So that is an important distinction to make. I mean, the drug is just some object or some substance. The U.S. is the effects that that substance has on you physiologically. That's the thing you are going to reflexively respond to. You don't well, maybe you do in some ways, some people, but you don't reflexively respond to a pile of heroin sitting there on the table. That doesn't do anything to you. It's when the heroin hits your physiology and starts messing things up. That's the biologically relevant stimulus. And your unconditional response, again, we're just talking about your basic straight up reflex here. Your unconditional response is to attempt to correct those disturbances. So the drug starts making your body temperature go up, well, things kick in to start bringing it back down, and so on. Now, one point, I'll save it. I'm sure it comes up later in the lecture, so I'll just skip over that idea for the time being. So here's our basic reflex that all this learning is built on. When these drugs mess up your physiology, you unconditionally, reflexively respond in ways to try and correct for those disruptions. Now, again, entirely reflexive. Okay, this is the point I keep thinking I'm going to make. Now, if you do a substantial dose of heroin, your body is going to be trying to counteract all those disruptions, but it probably won't be able to. I mean, you will still experience the effects of the drug. If your body was, completely able to completely compensate for all these disturbances, nobody would do heroin because it wouldn't do anything to you. Or maybe, it would do something to you for a couple of seconds, and then your body would just sort of cancel it all out. Yeah, that doesn't tend to be the way heroin works. So you take a big dose of heroin and your body's heating up and your breathing rate is slowing down and you're feeling really warm and fuzzy and your guts have ground to a halt. Well, even though you're not seeing these effects be wiped out by your reflexive responses, the drug effects can be more powerful than the ability of you to compensate for them physiologically. So we're still going to see people have temperatures go up and get constipated and all these other things. But the important point to remember here is that those systems that are designed to correct for those imbalances, they are working as hard as they can to try and correct for these disturbances. They just can't, they're overpowered by the effects of the drug. But they are still trying. You're still trying to make these things go away at a physiological level. Now, there's a lot of potential variability in here. There's all kinds of different things that might function effectively as a CS. And I'm lumping them all, at least for the most part here, into the term I'm going to use, contextual stimulant. The context is the CS. Now, again, heroin makes a really good example for this, better than some other drugs potentially, because heroin users are kind of, by necessity, they become real sort of creatures of habit. at least regular hardcore heroin users. There are people out there who use heroin who are not hardcore heroin users. I've known several of those people over my course of my life, where maybe every couple of months or something, somebody pulls out some heroin at a party, and you don't have to inject heroin. You can smoke it, you can snort it. There's other ways to get it into you. And there are people out there who will occasionally dabble. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the person who is injecting themselves with heroin 2 or 3 times a day. Now, these people, their life starts to really revolve around the drug and getting the drug and giving it to themselves and so on. And the rest of their life kind of has to fit into the in-between parts. And some people can manage that fine. I mean, they can do that. They can hold down jobs and have families and be more or less responsible citizens, but they're just high on heroin all the time. One of the last guys I remember meeting who was a full-blown, hardcore, everyday heroin user was an air traffic controller at Pearson Airport in Toronto, busiest airport in the country. Now, initially that might seem kind of alarming to you, but I'll tell you this: the day you don't want to fly into Toronto is the day he can't get heroin. That's the day he's going to kill everybody. As long as he can get his heroin, he was perfectly competent. I mean, he could do his job, but you don't want to be on a plane the day that he's going through withdrawal and he's got the shakes and he's puking and shitting and yeah, that's when he's going to screw things up. So you've got these long-term habitual heroin users. They tend to become, as I've said, creatures of habit. They tend to get these routines where they're doing the same things every day. You get up in the morning and you go into the bathroom and you brush your teeth, you jump in the shower, you get out, you sit down on the toilet, and you cook up a dose of heroin and you pop a vein and you inject yourself. And there you go, you got your morning dose of heroin. You can go on about your day. And you do that every day. Or maybe you sit down in your kitchen and it's 9:30 in the morning and there's this particular radio station on and you're listening to this radio show and there's your little picture on the wall and there's your clock over there, and all these stimuli are there in the context, in the environment, every time you do the drug. So if you're one of these regular drug users, and you're going through this routine every day where it's, wake up, go into the bathroom, go through your morning bathroom routine, which involves, injecting yourself with some heroin. All these things in the environment, all these things in the sort of the context of that you're doing that, can start to function as conditional stimuli. So at the, classical conditioning level, when you get up in the morning and you go into the bathroom, there's your toilet. Well, your brain sees, oh, toilet, oh, we're in the bathroom. We're going to be doing heroin soon. And these things can start to act as conditional stimuli. Just like little flashing green lights in an experiment. Stimuli that are reliably present right before the US is delivered. So, there's a lot of potential variability here, or a lot of potential different things that could serve as CSs here. Maybe you're doing your drugs at the same place every day, as I suggested. Now, some drugs aren't like this, but a lot of them are. These ones I have some familiarity with. If you're doing heroin, you can snort it or smoke it, but even then, there's some amount of preparation. But if you're injecting it, you have to, heroin's going to come in one of 2 forms. Here's some information you can use to go out and start a good heroin use career. You could either get white powder heroin, that comes from Asia, or you can get black tar heroin. It looks like a chunk of black, gooey tar, basically, and that's Mexican heroin. They'll both work equally well, but you've got to prepare either of those things. You've got to get it into some kind of liquid solution so you can get it into a syringe so you can inject yourself with it. And this involves you have to heat it up, and this is a whole little spoon thing with a candle. You got to put your heroin and a little bit of water in this spoon, and then heat it up so the heroin dissolves, and then you put that in your syringe and inject yourself. There's a whole little ritual that goes along with it, and there's a fair amount of various little bits of paraphernalia that are involved. The same thing's true with many other drugs. I mean, you got some big bag of weed, well, you don't just eat the thing, right? I mean, there's different ways of giving it to yourself, but you either got to, you're going to sit down and roll a joint, or you're going to sit there and pack your bong up, or you're going to, fire up your little, whatever that shit people are using to burn their houses down now, the shatter stuff. You got to get something really hot. So there's all these sort of rituals, these preparations, these bits of equipment that you use. You got some bunch of cocaine. Well, you got to just sit there and you chop it all up with your little credit card, and you make your little lines of cocaine and stuff. All these things that you do. There's these rituals that go along with getting the drug ready to use. Those things can function as a CS. Maybe something as simple as the time of day. Even for a drug as relatively, or at least we like to think, as relatively harmless as caffeine. There's probably people in this room who, have this regular, coffee or tea habit, or I don't know, you get up and drink one of those Monster, whatever those things are or something. But you get up in the morning, and it's 8 o'clock in the morning. I got to get my coffee, and if you don't get your coffee, that shit's going to start happening. But it may be just that time of day. You always get a coffee on the way to work. At like 7:30 in the morning, you're going to work, you pull into Tim Hortons, and you get your coffee or whatever. But I mean, think of the time of day is always the same. And now this is one of the things that we played around with. I don't want to get too deep into the pharmacology because that's not really the point here. But there are different methods of drug administration. Now, so far I've been talking about, primarily focusing on the idea of people injecting heroin intravenously. Now, if you do that, this would not be relevant. And again, without trying to encourage anybody to do anything like this, not because I care about you, just because I don't want to be legally responsible. Unless you have ever done this, it is very hard to appreciate the difference between, again, I don't know what level of experience any of you have with recreational drugs, but if somebody gives you a pill, so here's some ecstasy or something, we'll take this, it'll be fun, we'll go to the club and we'll love everybody. And so you take this pill, it's not like, and especially the first time you've done it, you don't know what to expect. Oh, what's going to happen? And so you're sitting around, and half an hour later, it's like, I don't know. Maybe it's no good. I don't feel anything. Nothing's working. And maybe you're going to be like 45 minutes, an hour in, and then all of a sudden you're like, ooh, my knees feel weird. And then things start going. But it takes a long time to build yourself up to the full effect of whatever dose of that drug you took if you take it orally. Now, a lot of people, again, like I said, heroin, you don't have to inject it. And most people probably don't start out doing that. People probably start out in terms of heroin use. Well, there's all kinds of other stories. I mean, a lot of them start out on prescription opioids. But if you're just starting out with heroin, most people are either smoking it or snorting it initially. But if they develop a serious habit, they almost always will end up injecting it. And this is true of other drugs as well. I mean, this is true of cocaine. People who have really serious cocaine issues, they're probably not snorting anymore. They're hitting themselves with cocaine right into the bloodstream. And the difference, again, I'm not encouraging you to go out and do stupid shit, but it's a profound difference between spending an hour getting very slowly drugged out to injecting something directly into a vein where it's like 1, 2, boom, full effect. After like a couple of seconds, like as soon as that shit hits your brain, boom, you're going 90 miles an hour. You're getting a full blast with the drug effect. And that is a very powerful stimulus. And that fundamentally is what a lot of hardcore drug users are really chasing, is that initial boom, that rush when the drug hits the system. And now, we did some work, and this is actually some of my work, that if you give a drug, if you take a drug by a more sort of slow-acting route, like you're taking pills or something, you know, even opioid drugs, you've got like a big bottle of Percocets or Vicodins or something, and you're taking those in pill form, so you're swallowing the pills. You're not going to get high, boom, like you got hit by lightning, like you would if you injected the stuff. But you're going to get high sort of more gradually. Now, if you regularly do drugs that way, one really reliable cue that the big drug effects are about to hit is when you experience the little early drug effects. The early effects of the drug are pretty reliably followed by the big disruptive effects. So if you're using a fairly slow route of administration for the drug, the early effects of the drug can act as a CS. And we did a lot of work using that idea, and it seemed to pan out. And you can tell this because when you, like any sort of classical conditioning situation, if the early effects of the drug are the CS here, well, let's say these numbers won't mean much to you, but let's say I'm normally giving you a dose of 50 milligrams per kilogram of heroin, which would be a monstrously big dose, but not probably going to kill you. At least I can keep you from dying. Now, I normally give you that, but I give it to you in a very sort of a slow onset route of administration. We can use something like if I give you a, say, 5 milligram per kilogram dose, a much smaller dose, I can use that to kind of replicate the early effects of the bigger dose. So this little dose will just feel like the big dose when it's just starting out. So, and that, we've demonstrated repeatedly, functions quite effectively as a CS in those occasions. We'll see you respond reflexively after you've been conditioned to that little dose of the drug as if it was the early effects of the big dose, and you'll start responding, compensating for it. Now, as has been the case with everything we talked about in this regard, the physiological benefit here is, again, being able to predict and anticipate and prepare for these biologically important events. So we learn to associate these contextual CSs with our drug effect US. We're going to be better prepared for it. And this is where our CR, our conditional response, or our conditional compensatory response. And the word compensatory, I'm not trying to say this is any different fundamentally from any other conditional response. It's just that word is in there to make it clear that what this response is doing is you are compensating, you're trying to compensate for these drug-induced disturbances. So once you've learned to associate the context with the drug effects, we don't just see that reflexive, unconditional, when the drug starts messing things up, physiologically you start kind of fighting back against it, trying to get things back where they're supposed to be. Once you've learned to associate the context with the drug, like any other conditioning situation, well, how is knowing it's going to happen going to help you in any way? Well, it's going to help you as soon as you see that toilet in your bathroom, or as soon as you sit down in your kitchen, or as soon as those early drug effects start, you start compensating. So in a lot of cases, you start, when you're CR, you are compensating for the drug effects. You start compensating for them before they even happen. So by the time that heroin hits the system, your body's already trying to push your body temperature down, trying to get your respiration rate up, trying to get your gastrointestinal motility rate up, and so on. So you start moving in the opposite direction of the way the drug's going to move you before the drug hits the system. And that makes the drug less disruptive when it does hit the system. So once you've learned to associate the context with the drug effects, as soon as you are exposed to the context, you start correcting for that disruption before it's actually started happening. That's going to make the drug much less disruptive when it does hit the system. Does that generally make sense so far? All right, a couple nods, that's good enough for me. Now, we can do a little more mapping. Each time you take the drug, you expose yourself to context, expose yourself to CS, and then give yourself the US. You administer the drug. There's a classical conditioning trial. CS paired with US. And like any other classically conditioned association, the more of these trials you do, the stronger that association is going to become. Which, in the context of this example, means you're going to get better and better at compensating for those drug effects before they happen. And again, you've got to keep the sort of, the drug buyer perspective and the physiological perspective separate here, because they have different goals. So, as the person who's paying their hard-earned or hard-stolen money for those drugs, what you find is you're getting less and less of the effect you're after. You're also getting less and less of those other effects that you're probably not after, but you're not getting as high as you used to. And again, what they're going to do in that case is they're going to start taking more of the drug. They're going to increase the dose to try and still achieve that disruptive effect that they're enjoying and doing the drug for. So, as you repeatedly give yourself these little drug conditioning trials, you are going to get better and better at compensating for these homeostatic disturbances, which means the drug is going to be less disruptive, which means it's going to have less of an effect on you, which means you are tolerant to the drug now. Now, this is what we would call associative tolerance, because you learned to do this based on exposure to stimuli. There are some aspects of drug tolerance, and this varies from one drug to the next, that are really sort of just physiological. You're just your body adapting to having some weird foreign substance introduced to it in some way. But there is some element of that. But the associative tolerance, this, I think, in a lot of ways, is the most important kind of tolerance that you develop. Now, again, we've covered these points, I think, already. So, the more tolerant you get, you're typically not going to sit there and just moan about how you don't get nearly as high as you used to on this drug. You're going to increase the dose. You're going to take matters into your own hands. And so people, as they become tolerant, they don't want to become tolerant from the drug user perspective. They want to get the most bang for their buck they can get. But they're going to have to do more and more of the drug as they become tolerant in order to achieve that effect they're after. Now, this associative tolerance, the fact that this happens, has a lot to do with both, what happens in terms of overdoses, at least the kind I was talking about earlier, and drug withdrawal. Now, as I said, there are some overdoses that are the result of people just doing the wrong shit. They don't know what's in it, and they get slipped something that's going to make them stop breathing in a hurry. That's not what I'm talking about here. And I'm not talking about the first-time rookie mistake people who just don't know what they're doing and do too much and get themselves in trouble. But in experienced drug users, this still happens all the time. This is maybe not the most common cause of drug overdoses, or at least of opiate overdoses these days. But it used to be, in the pre-fentanyl age, I would guess, people, again, people have been doing heroin every day for, a dozen, 15 years. And there's nothing wrong with their drugs, and they did the same amount they normally do, and yet they overdose. Well, there's a little bit more to the story. So imagine you're this long-term heroin user, and you've got this whole routine worked out, you've got your whole habit sorted out, and there's, a couple times a week or however often, depending on how much money you can get together, you got to go buy some heroin to get you through the next few days or something. And you've got a guy that you go to, your local friendly neighborhood heroin dealer, and that's your routine. Every few days you go see your buddy, you get some more heroin, and then every day you're going through the same routine, getting up, going to the bathroom, and everything's the same every day. Except the day you go over to your buddy's house to get the heroin, and he's not there. Because, he got arrested or something, he's in jail, or whatever, and he's not there, and you can't get your heroin from him. Well, now your routine is disrupted. Now, you're not just going to say, oh, gee, I really want to do heroin, what a drag, I guess I'll just go home and watch TV. No, you need to get some heroin from somewhere. So you call a couple of friends or make some inquiries and go, okay, there's some guy over there who's got heroin for sale, and somebody hooks you up, and so you get in a cab or whatever, go across town, go to this other guy's place, and okay, so you buy some heroin from this other guy. But now you're like an hour or more behind schedule. Your body wanted you to be doing that heroin like an hour ago, but you've been running all over town trying to find this stuff. So you need to get some heroin in you. Things are starting to go bad. You're starting to go into withdrawal. So rather than spend a half hour to get into another cab and go all the way back across town and go into your apartment and go into your bathroom and do you just, all right, I gotta do something now. So you just sit down in the stairwell of this guy's apartment building and you cook up your normal dose of heroin. Same dose you always do. Or like the dose you've worked your way up to at that point. And you inject it and you overdose. Nothing wrong with the heroin, compared to the normal heroin you do. You didn't do more than you normally would, but you overdosed. Well, why did you overdose? Because you did it in a different place. You did it without those context cues that you learned to associate with heroin. So, in conditioning terms, what you've done is you've given yourself the US, the drug-induced disturbances. But there was no CS there, because you weren't doing it in the same context that you normally do. Now, you take your normal dose in a new, different context. Well, that context CS isn't there, and if the CS isn't there, there is no compensatory conditional response. Your body doesn't start, trying to fight off the drug effect even before it happens, which means you have no associative tolerance now, which means that you get the whole, full force of that dose of the drug. Just like you took that much the very first time you did it. Yeah?
So for a user to get the most bang for the buck, they could theoretically just do a small amount at different locations, so tolerance doesn't kick in?
You could. It gets tricky because, your brain is pretty good at picking up patterns and things that repeat. So you could try to avoid this by saying, okay, I'm going to do heroin in a different place every time. That's going to be a little bit problematic. But even then, there's going to be some things that are going to be the same every time. Like even if you're in a different place every time, you may still go through the same routine with your little spoon and the candle and cooking it up, and so maybe that's the cue that you're going to latch onto. in theory, yeah, if you could do everything different every time, you would never develop any associative tolerance. But I think that's going to be pretty much practically impossible, and especially for people who don't have a lot of resources at their disposal. They're basically living in the park, and that's where they are. That's where they're going to be doing their heroin. So the failure of associative tolerance is one of the big reasons why people overdose on drugs. They don't do more than they normally do. There's nothing wrong with the drugs. They just did them in a different context and had no associative tolerance to that dose. Drug withdrawal, this was the stuff that I mostly focused on, at least in terms of my thesis research. In many ways, withdrawal is kind of the flip side of tolerance. So where we saw, if you present that drug effect US without the CS being there, you're not going to have any associative tolerance, and you could potentially overdose. What happens if you present the CS when the US isn't there? What we would think of as a test trial and a conditioning experiment. Well, let's see how much you have learned about this stimulus. We'll present the CS by itself. That's when we can actually see the conditional response. Anytime where you're actually taking the drug, well, then all these effects, we have to assume those are just your reflexive responses to the drug. But if we can see you making those same reflexive responses when the drug isn't there, when you start making those reflexive responses just to the CS, well, that's the bit of evidence that you've actually learned to associate the two. Well, what happens if you're that habitual heroin user again? What happens when you get up in the morning and you go in the bathroom and there's your toilet and there's the sink and you go through your routine, but no heroin? So you're exposing yourself to all these contextual stimuli, but there is no drug effect. Well, you're going to start, that CS is going to elicit this compensatory response, or a whole bunch of compensatory responses in a whole bunch of different systems. But there's no drug effect to compensate for. So what that will end up doing, especially if you have a well-learned, strong, associative tolerance built up from lots of years of heavy drug use, what happens now is homeostasis is disrupted in all those same systems, but in the opposite direction. You sit down in that bathroom, and you expose yourself to that context, your core body temperature starts going down. And your guts start moving faster. And your breathing starts moving faster. And you feel bad. I mean, all those things that the drug produces, the compensatory effects of that CS are producing the opposite. Now, this might not be 100% universally true, but it's pretty true for heroin. If you know what to look for, I know what to look for. If there was somebody in this room who was on heroin right now, and I cared, in about 15 seconds, I could figure out who it was. It wouldn't be hard. Yeah, if there was somebody in this room who was going through heroin withdrawal right now, I could figure that out in about a half a second. That would be pretty obvious, and you sort of learn to know what to look for. It's not hard to spot. Now, I'm not giving you a complete list here, but the kinds of effects that the drug produces physiologically, the withdrawal symptoms tend to be pretty much the exact opposite. So, when you've got opiates in the system, you will be constipated all the time. When you go into withdrawal, you have wicked diarrhea. Things are just flying through your digestive tract at top speed. This is probably one of the easiest things to pick up in terms of both opiate use and opiate withdrawal. Look at the eyes. I was watching some video, which I won't try to explain, but it was some comedians, and they're looking at these videos of other people, and they had these bunch of videos of this weird guy, and they were trying to figure out what his issue is. And I'm watching these videos that they're showing, and the first thing is, this guy's on heroin, because he's got these little, teeny, tiny pupils in his eyes. Even though it's bright, all kinds of different lighting conditions, he always has little pinpoint pupils. Well, that's a pretty, there's other reasons that can happen, but that's a pretty easy to pick up on sign that somebody is on opiate drugs. Teeny tiny pupils. Well, withdrawal, you got big giant pupils. Again, not too hard to spot. Not necessarily the most obvious symptom of withdrawal, but when you do the drug, your mucous membranes tend to dry up quite a bit. When you're going through withdrawal, your nose is running like a tap. And where the effect of the drug, at least neurologically, is to make you feel really good, when you're going through withdrawal, you feel really bad. And it's not just because, because something hurts so much or anything like that. Your emotional system is being depressed. You sort of go into a very negative mood state. Now, there's another guy. I don't think I have this on my list, but just in case I am talking some of you into taking up heroin here, I think I'll give you the whole story. Another issue with being on heroin, this may be somewhat different from the male and female perspective. Most of the heroin users I've ever known were all men. And this seemed to be pretty universally true, that at least until you get very, very, very tolerant to the drug, when you're on heroin, to phrase it somewhat inelegantly, this is the way one of these people described it to me, dick stuff doesn't work. So, not only, sex is kind of, at least in the conventional sense, probably not going to be on the menu while you're on heroin. At least if you're a man, you're probably not going to be able to maintain an erection of any kind. But also, problems with just peeing and stuff like that. That gets to be kind of difficult as well when you're doing a lot of heroin. Now, one of the maybe least unpleasant sounding withdrawal symptoms of that you experience opiates is spontaneous orgasms. Just out of the blue. Which you might think, well, that doesn't sound so bad. This is like happening when you're in line at the bank, right? It's maybe not the most socially appropriate place to be having orgasms. But everything about withdrawal is pretty much the diametrical opposite of the effects that you see when the person is actually on the drug.
With the same intensity?
Well, that depends on a lot of things. Maybe not quite. Because when you're on the drug, you've got this very powerful drug pushing all these systems in one direction. When you're going through withdrawal, it's just your body pushing in the other direction. And that may not be able to generate quite the amount of force in some of these systems that, a powerful external thing like the drug could do. So, but within the range that humans are physiologically capable of dealing, I don't know how fast things could go through your guts. But they're pretty much going as fast as your guts can make them go when you're in withdrawal. And they're pretty much not going anywhere when you're on the drug. Now, I don't know if any of you have any familiarity. Occasionally, I'm surprised at the number of people I've encountered over the years who are in some way involved in this issue, involved in sort of drug treatment or things like that, or they worked at a rehab facility, or they're involved in some way in the drug recovery business. Now, I don't know how much you know about any of that stuff, but if you don't know, take a guess. What do you think of all the people who go into a real, somewhat up and up, run by qualified people who know what they're doing, rehab program? what percentage of those people do you think relapse to drug use? So I'm kind of, how successful is rehab? Probably over 90% of people relapse. Yeah, now, if we could get 90% of people to never use the drug again, rehab would be awesome. But no, it's remarkably ineffective in the long term. You might go into rehab and clean yourself up for a little while, but the odds are pretty good that you're going to go back to using the drug. And conditioning analysis can tell us something about why that happens too. Now, if you, again, just to stick with heroin, if you are you're a long-term heroin addict, and somehow or other, I can get you into a rehab program. So I can get you into some kind of supervised facility where you're pretty much locked in, and you're going to have a fairly miserable week to 10 days of pretty serious withdrawal. Now, it's not going to be the worst thing in the world. It's certainly survivable. Heroin withdrawal isn't much worse than a bad case of the flu. But it'll go on for a week and a half. And then you will feel okay again. And you'll think, okay, I'm not feeling all sick anymore, and I haven't done any heroin for a couple of weeks, and I don't feel the immediate need to go out and do any heroin right now. I think I got it beat. And if I can keep you in a rehab facility for a couple of weeks, and a little bit of hand holding and bum wiping and so on, I can get you through that 2-week period where you can get over that withdrawal hump. That is the easy part. I'm not saying rehab facilities don't clean people up. I mean, they probably do, at least the good ones do. But it is a pretty Wild West business that requires virtually no licensing or regulation or anything. I mean, anybody, if you want to stick a sign out on your front lawn that says rehab clinic and have a bunch of junkies living in your basement, there's probably very little that's going to stop you from doing that, even if you have no idea what you're doing. Which is kind of scary. But so if you're ever shopping around for a rehab facility, do some shopping. Don't just sign up for the first thing that makes itself available. But that again is the easy part. Here's where the hard part comes in, and this is the part that I don't know how you could design a rehab program that a typical person could possibly afford that would deal with this. Because the way, if you really want to beat that heroin addiction, I mean, here's the problem. I get you into a rehab facility, a couple of weeks, get you over that withdrawal hump, and you feel okay, you think, all right, I'm not doing heroin anymore, and okay, so we let you out of the rehab facility. What do? Well, you're going to go home. You go home. At some point, you're going to walk into your bathroom, and there's your toilet, and there's the sink. All the CSs are still there in the environment, and you were feeling good. You thought, okay, I got this shit beat. And you walk into your bathroom, and boom, you're in full-blown heroin withdrawal again. And you know perfectly well how to make that stop. Do some heroin. And I mean, this is a huge factor in the kind of relapse rates, especially for drugs like heroin. And this is the problem. Now,
so if we know, or the people who is in this know that the contextual stimuli is going to be present when they get back to their own environment.
Yeah.
Why don't they also create this disruption in their own principal environment?
Some people could maybe do that. Do you want to throw something in there? Or?
I can let you finish, because I don't know how well this works for me or not.
Okay, but I mean, one of the problems is there may be a lot of people for whom that is not an option. I mean, if you got the money and the resources that you could just, okay, I'm just going to completely avoid my old life. I'm never going back to my old apartment. I'm never going to talk to my old friends. I'm just going to, I'm going to pack up my shit and move to Winnipeg. But nobody wants to move to Winnipeg. But you're going to completely cut yourself off from your old life and start anew. Maybe that would work. Maybe a little bit for a little while, but you're just, in that case, what you're doing, you're just sort of running away from the problem. You're not solving the problem. And even though that might work, I mean, you decide, okay, that's it, no more Vancouver, none of this shit, all cut off, I'm moving to Winnipeg, starting a new life. You get your apartment in Winnipeg, and the apartment has a toilet. Looks pretty much like the toilet that was in your old bathroom. And you walk into your new bathroom, and all boom, you're in withdrawal. I mean, it's very hard. I mean, I guess I'm going to pee outside for the rest of my life. I'm never going to use a toilet again. Well, maybe you can get away with it that way, but it's going to be a real struggle, and probably not going to be successful. Now, okay, yeah, what do you want to throw away?
So someone I knew went to rehab, and he was like, in rehab you have a set schedule that you follow, and there's people that are constantly thinking of you, so you don't have a chance to fuck things up for yourself. You just follow the schedule. But once you're out because of good behavior and you're like, oh, I'm clean, once you get home, you don't follow their schedule. You just do whatever you did before you entered rehab.
Yeah, you go back to your old patterns. I mean, that's what people will tend to do, right?
Even by moving around and trying to avoid your past life of doing drugs, you can, because at the end of the day, the schedule you had before rehab just sticks to it because that's what you remember the most. So you'll just end up doing drugs again, unless you're too motivated, like, nope, I'm not doing it, not doing it, not doing it, not doing it. But not everyone has strong willpower.
And that's basically the next part of the story. I mean, that is the only way you can beat the problem. That's the only way you can solve it, is you get out of rehab and you go back to your shitty little apartment and you get up in the morning and you go into your bathroom and there's your toilet and there's your sink and all that stuff, and you go into serious withdrawal. But you don't do heroin. You just suck it up and suffer through it. And the next day, you get up and you go into your bathroom, and there's your toilet, and you go into withdrawal. And you don't do heroin. You just suck it up. You have to extinguish those associations. You have to repeatedly present those CSs over and over and over again without throwing the US in there. So you got to expose yourself to all of those contextual cues time and time again, and they're going to make you feel really sick and shitty every time you do it, at least initially, until that stops. Until you can extinguish that association.
So the treatments should contemplate the aspect of supervision after being on the clinic and when you are in your regular environment?
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of, I mean, there's no rehab program I'm aware of that has that kind of resources where, when they let you out of the, lock-up facility where they know you can't get any drugs or anything, that they send somebody home with you to sit there and hold your hand while you're really wanting to do some heroin and they keep talking you down off the ledge, day after day after day for like 6 months. I mean, there are no resources for that to happen. And yet, that's probably the only real path to actually being free of that drug issue. You have to extinguish those contextual cues. Running away from them might work for a little while, but you're probably not going to be able to run away from them very effectively in the long term. You got to either extinguish them, or you just go back to drug use again. And then the whole merry-go-round starts again. You go back into rehab a couple of years later, and it won't work then either, for the most part. So it is a pretty nasty cycle, and as suggested, there are not a lot of people that got the willpower to muscle through that shit. It's not easy, but that is the only true path to Jesus here. You've got to suffer through all that extinction. Yeah.
If we somehow manage to start the drug in a different context every single time, is he going to somehow eliminate that fact of the poison?
Well, maybe. I mean, but again, there's probably going to be some contextual element that no matter how much you try and mix shit up is going to be the same every time. I mean, you're always going to have that needle in your hand. You're always going to be, tying off a vein. So I mean, all these kinds of things could function as the CSs. So I may be sort of oversimplifying things a little bit here, the way I'm describing them. But the idea that you could somehow never have the same context twice. Well, in theory, if you could do that, yeah, you wouldn't develop any of this tolerance. And then, just once you sort of got over the physiological withdrawal hump, you'd be in the clear. But it's probably practically impossible to do that. I mean, there's always going to be something. I mean, our brains are great at pattern recognition. You know, things start repeating, our brains will catch that. So your brain will find something that reliably precedes the drug use because it's almost impossible for that not to happen. So yeah, I mean, that would be the, you know, if you want to start using heroin regularly, I mean, I guess you can have lots of fun. It's not the most dangerous drug you can be doing. But if you ever want to get off heroin, well, you better hope you got some steel in your guts, because it's going to take a lot of willpower to work your way through that. Which is why, you know, the relapse rates tend to be so high, because very few people have that kind of jam. All right, let's take a 10-minute pause to refresh ourselves, and then we'll talk a little bit about time.
The thing that we talk about in math class, if you got, for example, if the CPS is the toilet.
Yep.
In order to increase the effectiveness of the extinguisher, so if you want to suck up the withdrawal effect, you should go into different contexts, like different toilet. Goes into different
Yeah, possibly. I mean, that would help. I mean, if you, well, I'm trying to think what effect exactly this maps onto. I mean, if you get like a really big toilet in your bathroom, then that would be like the, you know, the sort of the overtraining extinction effect or something. You know, or that would be, I guess that would be the magnitude effect. If you, I don't know, if you took like 17 poops a day or something, that would be like the overtraining extinction effect, and that might make things a little bit easier. You might get through the extinction process a little bit faster that way. But I'm not sure anybody is out there trying to encourage drug users to do this, so that, you know, if you ever do want to clean yourself up, it'd be a little bit easier if you make it easier to extinguish those cues. Now, even if you made it a little bit easier to extinguish those cues, it's still going to be a real struggle for the average person to get there. Could maybe make it a little bit shorter, but you would have had to know all of that stuff and put all that shit into effect when you started doing the drugs, when everybody thinks, oh, these are great, I'm going to live forever, there could not be a possible problem that occurs here. So they're not really building in these, you know, okay, here's my escape plan for how I'm going to get through withdrawal when my life is fucked up from one end to the other because of this drug. People don't tend to think that way. I mean, they might be able to save themselves a little bit of grief if they did, but they generally don't, in my experience. Any other issues, questions, concerns? All right, let's take 10, and then we'll talk about time. Thing I want to talk about a bit before we all go our separate ways. I mean, way back when, I don't know, many weeks ago, we were talking about classical conditioning. One of the things that we spent a little bit of time talking about was, you know, temporal factors. And time does make a difference. I mean, time is basically what makes the difference between, you know, simultaneous conditioning, short delay, long delay, et cetera, et cetera. There's, you know, the timing arrangement with which you present your stimulant. Now, I mean, we've seen that, you know, contiguity is important in both classical conditioning and operant conditioning. It's not the only important thing, and I hope I've made that point clear enough, that we have to think in terms of contingency in both cases to really understand what's going on. But nevertheless, generally we do have to have stimuli presented fairly close together in time for the conditioning to work. Now, most of the dealing that you do with time on a day-to-day basis, you sort of do using various mechanical, electronic aids. I mean, you've got clocks and this whole sort of system of dividing the day up into 24 hours, which each have 60 minutes and blah, 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 blah. And, you know, got little clocks on your phones, and some of you wear watches, and your clocks on the walls in your house. And I mean, that's the kind of dealing with time that we usually do. But the kind of timing I'm talking about here is independent of any of these sort of artificial time measurement systems that we have invented to try and keep track of shit. How do you learn? I mean, if that was the only way to learn about time, was to like learn how, you know, what that thing means and so on, which, a little bit of an aside, I am continuously astounded at the number of people these days I would not be surprised if there's anybody in this room, and don't tell me if you're one of these people, because then I'll just want to like punch you in the head or something. There are people who can't tell time on analog clocks.
No, I was gonna say I work with kids, and I don't know if it's because of a digital thing.
It's because of digital clocks.
Elementary, 10-year-old kids,
Yeah.
they look at the clock and they have no idea. So we have a clock and then there's like the stove, and they will all look at the stove for the time because they cannot, and they get embarrassed because their parents come in and they're like, okay, what time is it, honey? And they're like, oh, okay.
5:45.
I was, in my last job at a different university, the final exams were run somewhat differently. Like all the final exams, you would be writing in this big gym, and they'd have like 15 courses all writing at the same time. Hundreds of people in the gym for 3-hour sessions, over a course of a number of days. And you would get, you just get told you have to proctor, some exam session. So you got to be one of the half dozen, professors that shows up and just kind of wanders around keeping shit under control and so on. And I'm doing this. All these different people are writing different final exams. I'm just sort of walking up and down. And this is a university student. They sort of ask me, oh, what time is it? How much time's left? And I just point at the giant clock on the wall of the gymnasium. And I go, what time is it? I walked away. They're like, okay. No, I'm not having any patience for that shit. Learn how clocks work, or get used to not knowing what time it is. But we're talking about your intuitive sense of time. I mean, if clocks and watches and things like that were the only way it could work, then humans presumably would be the only creatures that could have any sort of useful concept of time. And that's clearly not true. All kinds of other learning creatures are perfectly capable of learning about time. Basically, what we're talking about learning here is how long is it going to take something to happen? Just going on your own little internal sense of how much time has passed, rather than looking at clocks or watches and things like that. Now, there are a number of different experimental paradigms. I'm going to try and at least briefly explain each of them. This one I'll get into a little more detail a bit later. This is one of the big ones called the peak procedure. So I'm not going to explain that one right now. And then we've got what we call bisection tasks. I'll give you a little demonstration of this. And a third one, what's called the time left procedure. And I'll try and give you at least a brief idea of how that sort of shit works as well. Now, I'm introducing this a little bit earlier than I probably need to, but one of the little bits of terminology that's going to come up at least a handful of times here is we use the term like the symbol, T star. And whatever kind of timing issue we're investigating, T star is the time interval that we're using to be tested. So I mean, if we set up some experimental paradigm where something is going to happen 10 seconds after something else happens, well, if we're using rats or mice or something, they don't know 10 seconds. I mean, they'll have watches and clocks and shit like that. But will they be able to learn that it's going to take so long to there's no point responding until 10 seconds has passed, kind of thing. In that case, T star would be 10 seconds. So whatever the target time interval is we're working with, we tend to use this symbol T star. And that'll come up when we start talking about the peak procedure a little bit. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of how some of these things work. Now this is a badly and hastily constructed example that I just threw together fairly recently to try and give you an idea of a bisection task. Now, when I was in graduate school, one of the professors, and she was actually on my committee, she wasn't my supervisor, but I had to deal with her quite a lot. And she was interested in timing, and I signed up, she was using human subjects, and I signed up because there was money involved. We got paid to be research subjects. And the deal was, I signed up for this bisection experiment that she was running, which meant I had to go in, and I could sort of do this whenever I wanted, basically. I didn't have to show up at some preordained time, but I had to put in 10 sessions, each one of which lasted about 45 minutes. I was sitting at a computer doing these bisection tasks. in order to get whatever lump of money was involved. And they all worked something like this, where you're sitting down, you're looking at a computer screen, and I'm going to show you a couple of standards. Now, the duration, the time element is just, the duration which these things appear on the screen. So here's the short standard. Okay, so however long that thing was up on the screen, that's the short standard. Now here's the long standard. This one's going to, understandably, be up there for a little bit longer. And eventually, this one goes away too. So that's the long interval. So we've got a short interval and a long interval. And now, here comes the testing part. I'm going to present little squares on the screen that are going to be up there for some period of time. And your job is, on each one of these trials, to push one of two buttons. There's a button you can push if you think that was closer to the short time, and there's another button you push if you think that was closer to the long time. So, let's see, by show of hands, what you think here. Is that closer to the short one or the long one? I think it was slightly closer to the short one. I can't remember. I'd have to look at the whatever I loaded in here. But now, imagine doing that over and over and over again. Not exciting. Now, I can remember, when this study that I participated in, we actually got to see all the results because this woman, Lorraine, she gave some little talk. She gave some presentation where she was presenting this data. This was maybe a year after I'd done it. And it turned out she had all the subjects just identified by initials. But, everybody knew everybody in the department, so you could pretty much figure out who everybody was up on this screen. And my little graph was by far the best. And I was so proud for absolutely no reason that, I was really good at this. And that kind of surprised me because my recollection of doing these things, a lot of the time, just given the way my schedule worked, I would have to go in and do these things sort of first thing in the morning. I'd have to go, an hour early or something so I could get in a session of this shit before the rest of my day started. And I swear, there was a good amount of me waking up and going, blah. Because I would fall asleep sitting there, watching these things going. But still, I was apparently very good at it. Now, I'm going to throw a little bit of unnecessary math at you here. One of the things, and this is kind of the interesting phenomenon, and we won't get too deep into why it's interesting, because that would take a long time. One of the things you can determine here is, where do your subjects draw the line? Where do you draw the line on one side of which you'll say things are short, they're closer to the short one, and on the other side you'll say they're closer to the long one? Well, this involves a concept you may not be familiar with. Whether they're humans or pigeons or rats, there's a very strong tendency to divide at the geometric mean. Does anybody know what a geometric mean is? Anybody ever encountered this? There's several different kinds of means. I don't know, maybe nobody ever exposed you to this, but you might have bumped into this when somebody was explaining all that Pythagoras trigonometry business at some point where you weren't really paying attention. But there are 4 Pythagorean means. Now the one you're familiar with, at least I assume you're familiar with, is what we call the arithmetic mean. And you've all taken a stats course, you've all seen that little bit of stuff there, right? The sum of x divided by n. You add up, if you want the arithmetic mean of things, you add up all the things, and then divide by the number of things, and that gives you your arithmetic mean. Now that's an appropriate technique, that's an appropriate mean for things where, and I don't want to, if this doesn't make any sense, don't worry about it, but that's an appropriate mean for things where adding makes sense. We're talking about things that are basically additive in nature. Time is not really like that. The geometric mean, well, that's my version of the little formula there, which probably doesn't make much sense, but don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to calculate the geometric mean of anything on the final exam. But it's the nth root of n number of things that you multiply together. So now I'm pretty sure when I had that little example, I think I set it up so that the short standard was up there for 2 seconds. And the long standard was up there for 8 seconds. Now, this is not, I don't think, calculator-worthy math. You've got two numbers, 2 and 8. What is the arithmetic mean of those two numbers? 5, makes sense, right? 2 plus 8 divided by 2. 2 plus 8 is 10. There's two numbers divided by 2, so the arithmetic mean is 5. The geometric mean of 2 and 8 is 4. And to get the geometric mean, what you do is you multiply all the numbers together, however many numbers you got, and then you do the nth root of that product. Now again, this is all kind of irrelevant. I'm just trying to explain to you what a geometric mean is. So if you have 2 and 8, you go 2 times 8, and because there's two numbers, you're going to take the square root of that. If there was 3 numbers, you'd do the cube root. If there was 4 numbers, you'd do the, whatever the hell you call the 4 root. So this, again, I don't think is particularly calculator-worthy math. 2 times 8 is 16. What's the square root of 16? 4. So the geometric mean of 2 and 8 is 4. And that is very reliably where people will form that dividing line. So even though in the arithmetic sense, 5 is exactly halfway between 2 and 8, that's not where people draw the line. They draw the line at 4. So if it's 4 seconds, or if it's shorter than 4 seconds, they'll say it's short. If it's longer than 4 seconds, they'll say it's long. And that has some implications that we won't really get into. I just wanted to try and explain that, that particular task. Now this is an explanation. When I was doing a postdoc, we were doing some of this, and my boss at the time, who I maintain was one of the smartest human beings on the planet. And I'm not the only one that thinks that. This guy is like a certifiable genius in many ways. Why he wanted me to work with him is a mystery that remains. But I was so proud of this because we were talking about this time left task, and he was describing how he was trying to explain this to other people, and people had a hell of a time understanding what he was talking about. And he was telling us, I've struggled for like 20 years to think of a way to explain the time left procedure so people can understand it. And I came up with this, and he thought, this is great, and he started using it. So this is my little food court explanation. So this is a shitty food court. So you are going out for lunch. You got to go, you got your job, and you're going to go eat some lunch, and your goal, generally, is to get your lunch as soon as you can. You want food now. You want food as soon as possible because you're hungry. Now, you go to this shitty little food court, and there's only 2 restaurants in this food court. There's the pizza place and there's the burger place. And you know, based on experience, that it will take you 10 minutes to get your pizza. You got to line up for 10 minutes to get a piece of pizza, or whatever the pizza guy sells. Burgers only take 5 minutes. You only wait 5 minutes for a burger. Now, the problem is, the burger guy is often off wandering around in the back of the restaurant or something. So you walk up to the food court, and every day, the pizza guy is standing there at the counter, ready to take your order. Except it's going to take you 10 minutes to get to the front of the line. Burger guy's not there. Now, so what are you going to do? Well, you are going to go line up in the pizza line. Now, at some point, while you're waiting, and this is what we sort of vary experimentally, at some point, while you're waiting in the pizza line, burger guy shows up. Are you going to change lines? No, maybe.
That's true.
Not true.
Depends on how long you have been
it depends on how long you've been waiting for pizza, right? Now, if you had a watch and you were timing this out and you were sort of, being very explicit about all these intervals, if Burger Guy shows up anytime in the first 5 minutes, you should switch lines. If there's more than 5 minutes left to wait for your pizza, if you switch lines when Burger Guy shows up, you'll get your food faster, all right? It's only going to take 5 minutes. So you've been waiting 4 minutes for pizza, and Burger Guy shows up, you're going to switch lines, because then you will get your food having waited a total of 9 minutes. If you've been waiting in line for 6 minutes in Pizza Guy's line when Burger Guy shows up, you probably shouldn't switch lines, because you're going to get your food in a total of 10 minutes, whereas if you switched at that point, you'd wait a total of 11 minutes to get your food. So when we were doing this with mice, and mice are not very smart, at least not in the big scheme of things, but they could still figure this out. I mean, they would show, when you give them, option A is available immediately, but there's a long wait to get that reinforcer. Option B, there's less of a wait to get that reinforcer, but you never know when that's going to become available. So by manipulating this and by changing when Burger Guy shows up, we can see, at what point will you switch lines? When are you going to switch and when are you going to stay? Well, that's going to depend on your estimate of how long you've been waiting for this thing when that guy shows up. Does that sort of make sense? All right. Now, again, I'm not going to talk about the data or anything too much with regard to this particular type of task. But we'll get into the peak procedure in a bit more detail in a minute. But first, I want to talk a bit about this sort of fundamental idea that's underlying all of this, of the internal clock. I mean, how is any organism coming to some judgment about time without having little watches and clocks and things like that? Well, the same way that we do when we don't have watches and clocks. Now, there's still some question about exactly how this works. As far as I know, nobody's quite worked this out. We worked out some of this stuff. Just an example, again, that you don't need to care or worry about too much, but all that circadian rhythm stuff that you learned about at some point, where there's sort of these 24.5-hour cycles that we go through, where we're continuously readjusting based on light and dark cues. We know what part of the brain does that. At least we know what part of the brain does that in hamsters. It's the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And there's been some really interesting research done with hamsters where you can take this bit of the brain out of two hamsters and switch it. And these hamsters will now be on each other's circadian schedules. So that's pretty compelling evidence that this is the part of the brain that determines that. Now, but even though we still haven't quite isolated how we do this in general, there's all kinds of possible candidates. It's not like we can't figure out how this could possibly work. It's more a question of, there are so many ways that this could work that we haven't really narrowed down which of them are actually relevant. We're full of systems that are producing some kind of regular rhythmic pulse, so to speak, that operate on some sort of steady rhythm. And that's the first thing we need. We got to have something that operates on some kind of steady rhythm to use as the basis of our timing system. Now, there are a lot of different models of an internal clock, and I'm not going to get into a whole lot of detail about any of this, but I'm going to give you the sort of the basic outline of how we generally think an internal clock has to work. So, first thing we got to have is what we're going to call a pacemaker. And this is some little bit of biology that produces sort of a steady, sort of pulsing signal. So, and there's all kinds of potential candidates biologically for things that will do that. I mean, it's not going to be hard to find something that operates like that. So we've got something that we're going to call a pacemaker that can sort of produce a steady stream of, let's just call them pulses. And then that is connected to some kind of switch And the switch is some sort of biological mechanism. Again, there's all kinds of possibilities. I'm not going to get into how this would work, but the switch can sort of open or close. And if the switch closes, if the switch is closed, well then there's nothing much going on. But when you start trying to estimate how long something is taking, what you do is you open that switch, and then all those little, once that switch is open, all the little pulses generated by the pacemaker get over into something we're going to call the accumulator. Now, the longer you have that switch open, the more pulses are going to accumulate. And then, when the event stops, you close the switch. So now you sort of have some measure of, okay, how many pulses did that take? Now, that value, this will maybe make a little more sense when I describe the peak procedure in more detail. So how long something took right now, some event that you're just currently experiencing, you've just sort of timed how long that took to happen by allowing little pulses to accumulate in the accumulator for the duration of that event. When the event ends, you close the switch, and that's how many pulses you got. Now that value gets moved into your working memory. So you're consciously aware at some level, okay, this took that long. Now you don't have a minute seconds label to apply for it. You just got some sort of mental impression of this took that amount of time. Now, eventually, that information that's made in your working memory, if you have a sufficient rehearsal and you don't get disrupted and all the various other memory things that you might have learned about, that bit of information will get stored in, well, I'm calling it reference memory here, what we refer to generally as long-term memory. Now, the next time you experience this event, when the event starts, you open the switch and little pulses start accumulating, and that value is available in working memory. And here's the last little bit of our model, the comparator. So or at least in the pulses sense, in the internal clock sense, you've got some measure stored in your reference memory of how many pulses this thing took to happen last time. And now the thing is happening again. And you're timing the current interval as well. So those pulses are accumulating, and that value is in working memory. And now you pull the old value from last time out of reference memory, and the current value, they both go into this comparator, which is basically telling you, are these two values the same or are they different? And if those two values are sufficiently similar, your internal clock basically tells you, yes, okay, that amount of time has passed now, you can do your response or whatever is required to be done. And if those amounts are still too different, well, the comparator says, no point responding yet. Not enough time has passed. Is there anything particularly puzzling about this idea? Or is this more or less making sense? I don't think it's too bizarre. I'm not getting into a whole lot of detail. So you time how long things take to happen, and then those values go into reference memory. And the next time that thing happens, if you're sort of timing it out, how long do I got to wait to have the thing happen? Well, you're comparing how long it took last time to how long has passed this time. And when those values get similar enough that, okay, the right amount of time has passed and you can do whatever it is you're going to do based on that time value. Well, talk about I'm not going to read through all this stuff again. This is all the stuff I just sort of told you about that model. So rather than rehash this stuff, I'll let you, and it's going to be in the posted notes, you can get it from there. I'm just going to move on here. Now, I should probably start explaining the peak procedure idea. Now, I've done this with humans, I've done this with rats. I've done most of the work I've done using the peak procedure with mice. Now, well, we'll kind of get back to the reason we're using mice in this lab. We're going to try and explain what we were trying to do here. But the peak procedure is basically a situation. So let's talk about it in terms of rats, because we've talked about rats quite a lot. So we've got basically an operant chamber that has a lever in it that you can push to get a piece of delicious food. No complicated schedules, no delays, anything. I mean, when the lever is active, you push it, you immediately get your little piece of food. But there is timing involved, and this is how a peak procedure works. So let's say our target time, our T star, is 10 seconds. So what that means is, some little light or some stimulus comes on in the chamber. And 10 seconds after that light comes on, you can press the lever and get a piece of food. So, pressing it before the 10 seconds is up isn't going to get you any food. I guess you could wait longer than 10 seconds and it would still get you a piece of food. But what we're doing is we're going to test, how good are our subjects at time in this little interval. Now, this also depends on the assumption that your subjects are trying to behave somewhat efficiently. So, if T star is 10 seconds, the light comes on, and 10 seconds from now, you can press the little lever and get a piece of food. Well, you could just, as soon as the light comes on, go over and start banging away on that lever. And eventually 10 seconds would pass and ching, you get the piece of food. But that's not very efficient behavior. It would be more efficient if you could just estimate pretty well, okay, the light came on, so I'm going to wait a little while, and all right, I think now is the time to go over and press the lever and get the piece of food. So now, you're not going to be perfectly accurate. But at some point, according to this, internal clock idea, you measured, you've got this sort of recording in your internal clock, or in your reference memory, of what your internal clock said last time this happened. The light came on. When the light comes on, you open the little switch, and pulses start accumulating. And at some point, pressing the lever works, and a piece of food shows up. And at that point, you close the switch. So you've got this measurement of how much time passed between the light coming on and me actually being able to make some food happen. So on the next trial, you go in there, you're comparing. What value did I record the last time? And what value are we at now? The light comes on, you open the switch, and you start comparing. How much time has passed this time compared to the reference value I have of how much time it took for this to work last time. And rather than just banging away continuously, which is a very inefficient way to get your food, you're going to hold off. You're not going to start pushing that lever until the current value that you're timing gets sufficiently close to the value that's in your reference memory. Maybe not exactly the same, but you're not going to start pressing the lever right away. But as soon as the currently timed value starts getting close to what's in reference memory, then you'll go over and start pressing the lever a little bit. And that tells us how long you think that interval is. Now, again, let me just go on and explain the peak procedure. You can go back and read that sentence, and it'll make more sense. It'll make more sense later on. So, during a peak procedure, we're doing basically what I said. The way we did it, we had everything sort of operated. We had mice running these operant chambers for like 12-hour shifts. And every 12 hours, some undergrads would come in and take those mice out and put them back in their home cages and clean them up and put some new mice in and push some buttons, and then they'd go for 12 hours. So the mice were getting a lot of food out of this. And they were also, they're providing a lot of data because we're collecting huge amounts of data when we did this. Now, so if our, the interval that we're using is, say, 10 seconds. Light comes on, and 10 seconds later, pushing the lever will get you the piece of food. And if you respond, if you're pushing that lever before the 10 seconds is up, that's not going to get you any food. But there's no real penalty there. You're just kind of wasting your time. So you go through a bunch of trials like this, and we'll be able to see from your behavior, at least indirectly, that you're starting to get the hang of this. You don't, when the light comes on, you don't run right over the lever and start pressing right away. You go over there, sometime when it starts getting close to 10 seconds and you start banging away, at least if you're reasonably good at this sort of timing thing. So, subject to that, all these trials where, responding was reinforced a certain time interval after some stimulus came on. Now, in order to actually test what you think is going on, we need to stick in the equivalent of what we would call a test trial. We call them probe trials. At least that was the term we used to refer to them. But basically, it means the same thing as test trials. Now, we had a lot of these. Depending on the particular protocol we had in effect, somewhere, 1 out of 3, or more frequently, but 1 out of 5 of these trials would be a probe trial. And on a probe trial, the little light would come on, like it normally does, but you're not going to get the piece of food no matter what. I mean, no reinforcement will be delivered on a probe trial. And this is where we're actually getting the data that we're going to examine. So on a probe trial, that light comes on, and at some point, when your little internal clock tells you that the time that has passed right now is getting close to the interval you remember being reinforced at, you'll go over and start pressing the lever. Now, unlike all those other trials, it never works. You don't get any food. And 10 seconds passes and you're still pressing the lever and nothing's happening. And maybe, around 12 or 13 seconds, you just, all right, fuck this, it's not working this time. And you give up and you stop. Now, in all those other trials, you would have stopped as soon as the food arrived at, 10 seconds or whenever you press the lever. But on these probe trials, you're going to start responding at some point, and then you're going to give up at some point after T star has passed, when you still haven't got any reinforcement. That produces data that looks kind of like this. Now, there's some funny business in here that I will get around to explaining, so I won't address it right now. But we've got our subjects in the chamber, and we've set our T star time to be 10 seconds. So 10 seconds after some stimulus is presented, responding is reinforced. And this is the graph, just a handmade facsimile of the data that I threw together quickly, so I'll get two attached to it as an accurate representation, I think. But what we're looking at here is, over time, on the probe trials, what is the probability that you are pushing that lever at any given point in time? And with a T star of 10 seconds, on the probe trials, for the first 5 seconds, basically, there is 0 probability that you're pressing the lever. You're not that bad at timing. So there's no point going over and pressing it yet, because we're not even close to the elapsed time interval. And then once you get it, now there starts to be a small probability. And as we get closer and closer, now, here is the sort of the peak probability. This is when you are most likely to be pressing the lever. Now, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but you will notice that's not exactly at 10 seconds. That's not uncommon. Now, so, again, is it clear what this graph is showing? Okay. Now, so we can sort of plot where, and these distributions, at least this is the story I'm telling you, these little distributions, these probability distributions of when you are most likely to respond, tend to be, at least in a simple version of a peak procedure, pretty symmetrical. So there's a bit of a fudge factor built in here. I mean, you're not super accurate, but you're starting about the same amount of time before T star as you are persisting afterwards, before you give up. So you're starting a little bit early, and you're giving up at some point when nothing happens. And it produces a fairly symmetrical distribution in terms of the probability that you're pressing the lever. Now, what if we do a target interval of 20 seconds? So, the light comes on, you've got to wait 20 seconds before responding is reinforced. Well, we see data that might look something like that. Again, at some point, before the 20 seconds, before T star, you start responding, but there's still a fairly low probability. And that probability gets higher and higher and higher and peaks at some value. And then, if it's one of those probe trials where you never get reinforced, eventually you will give up and stop responding. Now, this data is not apparent here, but I'm going to try and make it apparent and hopefully not confuse the hell out of everybody. There's something systematic going on here. There's a couple of systematic things going on here, which people who are interested in timing have found very interesting. Now, as I tried to illustrate in that little fake graph there, the greater the value for T star is, the bigger that time value is, the wider that curve is, the more variability there is in the probability of responding over time. Real short, T star values of like very small times tend to produce very narrow curves, and the longer the value of T star is, the wider that curve will get. So the variability in the responses increases with the length of the target time interval. Now, this is one of the properties that people have found interesting about this data, which says something fundamental about how time works in the brains of organisms that are trying to figure it out. That variability is scalar. Now, what does it mean for variability to be scalar? Well, it means that that variability is directly proportional to the length of the target interval. Variability is proportional to T star. So the bigger T star is, the more variability there is. And it's not just sort of random, it's very systematic. And one way to sort of demonstrate this, I'm not sure if you're familiar with these concepts, but is if we time normalize that data will superpose. Now, what does that mean? Well, I'll try and show you. So to time normalize the data, so we've got our raw data. There's our raw data. That's what you did when we were using a 10-second T star. That's what you did when we were using a 20-second T star. Time normalizing the data means that all the data, basically all your raw numbers, so I mean this is basically 5 seconds, 6 seconds, 7 seconds, 8 seconds, and so on, all these raw numbers in here when you push that lever. We take all that raw data, all those raw numbers, and everything gets divided by T star. That's how you time normalize. And then we'll do the same thing with the 20-second data. So all the raw data in the 10-second distribution basically gets divided by 10. All the data in the 20-second distribution gets divided by 20. And this is basically going to take apples and oranges here and make them both, oranges or whatever. They're both going to be on the same scale now. So when I'm going to make these be a little bit different from each other just so you can see that there's two curves there, but they would actually sit right on top of each other generally. So once we normalize T star, or the equivalent of T star, is always going to be 1. So 1 is going to be at the center of our distribution. And if that doesn't make sense to you mathematically, I'm not sure how much help I can be. But, I mean, if we're dividing everything in here by 10 seconds, well, our target time is 10 seconds. What is 10 seconds divided by 10 seconds? 1. What is 20 seconds divided by 20 seconds? 1. So when we start time normalizing all this stuff, where, you know, the mean of this, well, it's not, but let's just say it was 10 seconds, and the mean of this might be 20 seconds. Well, the mean of both of those distributions, when we normalize them, is going to be 1. And they're going to sit right on top of each other. So that's what our normalized 10-second data would look like. And that's what our normalized 20-second data would look like. This is what we call superposition. Now, that's getting to be a very messy graph. Apologize for that. But this time normalizing, by taking data collected with different time intervals as the target, we divide all the raw data by whatever the target interval was. That puts everything on the same scale. Now, that's what it means to say that this variability is scalar. The variability is proportional to the target interval. And when we do this little bit of math to make the target interval basically the same for all the distributions, the variability turns out to be exactly the same for all these distributions. All's right on top of this, you know, of each other. Does that make sense at least a basic sort of level? Yeah.
When you say that you combine the raw data, what numbers are you talking about? What data?
Okay, so I've got you doing one of these peak procedure things. Okay, so let's say that, you know, the target T star is 10 seconds at this point. Now, on the probe trials, where you're not going to get any food, even when you know, at the right interval, you start pressing at some point before 10 seconds probably, and you'll give up at some point after 10 seconds. So let's say the first time you press the lever is at 8 seconds. So what's 8 seconds divided by 10 seconds? 0.8. Then you press again at 9 seconds. What's 9 divided by 0.9? And so these are the things we are converting. So everything, you know, in the 10-second distribution, everything that was 8 seconds becomes 0.8, and 9 seconds becomes 0.9, and 10 seconds becomes 1. And in the 20-second distribution, 18 seconds becomes 0.9, and 16 seconds becomes 0.8, and so on. So it's a wider spread, but you're condensing it all into the same distribution with the same mean by this normalization process. Is that making sense? Okay. Now, the fact that there is variability, I mean, we do not see organisms, you know, humans, rats, pigeons, mice. I mean, there are no organisms that are perfect at this. There are no organisms that are so good at this that after a couple of trials, they will just go over it once exactly at 10 seconds and get their food. Sort of scared people. So there's always a little bit of variability in the response. You're not exactly sure. So that's a little bit of noise somewhere in the timing system. Now, without going down a very deep rabbit hole where we all get lost, including me, the fact that this variability is scalar, that it's always proportional to the time interval being measured, that puts some fairly strict limits on where that variability could be coming from. Now, I'm not going to go too far down that road, but you can just sort of take my word for that. That eliminates, the fact that it's scalar means that there's all kinds of potential random noise. Well, that's not what's doing it. This variability isn't random. This variability is very systematic and proportional to the time interval being tested. So this really limits the possible sources of where this variability comes from. Now, another issue is, you will note, and I did briefly mention this earlier, now I don't have my little number scale down here, which makes it probably more difficult to make this point, but the peak value where were you most likely to respond when T star was 10 seconds? Where were you most likely to respond when T star was 20 seconds? Those values typically will not be 10 seconds and 20 seconds. So we've got scalar variability. We also have what we call scalar error. Different organisms, now this can vary a lot from one organism to the next, but within a single organism, we tend to be proportionally wrong across a wide range of time intervals. So, I mean, again, if T star was 10 seconds, if that was the interval you were expected to get a grip on, but it turned out that the peak of your responding, the time you were most likely to be pushing that lever was 11 seconds. I mean, we could say in absolute terms, you were peaking 1 second late. But the more relevant way to think of it is you were peaking, 10% late. And if we look at your behavior on 20 seconds, if you peaked at 11 seconds for a 10-second T star, where are you going to peak for a 20-second T star? 22 seconds. Right? It's going to be proportional. You're going to be off. You're going to have the same margin of error proportional to the target value across all these different time intervals that we could test you. You're going to be, you're, on one hand, you could say in absolute terms, yeah, you're 1 second late on the 10-second interval, and you're 2 seconds late on the 20-second interval. But you could also say, you are 10% late on every interval that we test. And that tends to be very consistent as well. So we've got scalar variability, and we've got scalar error. So not only is how variable the time you respond at directly related to the time interval we're testing, but how wrong you are is also directly proportional to the time interval that you are being tested on. And as I kind of showed you, without explaining it in great detail in that last little graph, this error is also scalar. So when you superpose, when you time normalize everything, again, the distributions all line up right on top of each other, and you're going to see that you're off by the same proportion with every time interval that we test you on. Now, for the same reasons I'm not going to discuss in great detail, that also very much limits the possible sources of that error, if it's that systematic. Now, this is the reason that the lab I was working in at the time was interested in this. Ultimately, our goal was not to really figure out how timing works. Time was just one way we thought we might get a handle on a much bigger question. We were trying to develop some kind of procedure where we could ultimately maybe get at the genetic basis of memory and how memory works, and why different organisms have different memory capabilities and capacities and so forth. Why, some people have really good memories, other people have shitty memories, and so on. So, something, not random, but something very systematic is going on in this timing data. And I'm not sure if I make this point in the next couple minutes here, but it's very variable. I'm not trying to suggest that everybody has the same scalar variability and scalar error. You might have, very narrow curves for every time interval, and you might be like 10% early all the time. And, she might have great big wide curves, and she's like 15% late every time. So it's not like everybody's early or everybody's late. Individual people or organisms, they could be all over the place, but the individual people will be very consistent across a whole range of different time intervals that are being tested. The next person could be very consistent, but in a very different way, making a different kind of error and so on. So, Okay, I guess I am making that point here. So that fixed proportion is very, well, to use the fancy word, idiosyncratic. It's different for every individual. But within a particular individual, it tends to be very consistent. It can change from one person to the next. Some people are early, some people are late, some people are very variable, some people are not so variable. But people tend to be pretty consistent. And so do mice and rats and pigeons and anything else that I've ever tested this out on. Now, what we were doing was ultimately, we were trying to find some way, and this was the thought, and we developed a whole other more complicated procedure that we called the tri-peak procedure, where we were basically testing 3 different time intervals at the same time, and I won't bother trying to explain that to you, it gets kind of confusing. But we were trying to develop a procedure, and this is why we had to sort of, the mice going in 12-hour shifts, trying to really automate stuff and collect huge amounts of data without a whole lot of hands-on work. To develop a procedure, and this is why we use mice, because we're interested in genetics, and mice are probably the go-to complex species for doing genetic analysis. So we thought if we could identify systematic differences in the ability of different mice to do this. I mean, some mice are early, some are late, some are big gradients, some are small gradients, and so on. And then it's pretty easy, at least even at the time we were doing this, mice genetics were fairly well known. So if we could find genetic differences in the mice that kind of matched on to the timing differences that they showed in their behavior, we thought that might start to give us a handle on what sort of genes and gene products are involved in memory. I mean, in remembering these time intervals, because different organisms are differently good at this. So we were trying to, I hope that makes some level of sense. I mean, you don't need to understand that in any great detail, because I don't even understand it in any great detail anymore. But this was the whole point. We're ultimately trying to find some sort of very high volume, high throughput test of memory that we could then relate to genetic differences, so we could maybe start working out how memory worked at a genetic level. And that is all the shit I'm going to pretend to teach you, and you're going to pretend to